Hi, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is my video for the Lindenwood University MFA program, MFA in Writing program specifically, the course on classic horror and sci-fi by women writers. And I want to start off with a little reading. His first job was a shield, a broad one, thick, well-fashioned everywhere. A shining rim he gave it, triple ply, and hung from this a silver shoulder strap. 5 welded layers composed the body of the shield. The maker used all his art adorning this expanse. He pictured on it earth, heaven, and sea, unwearied sun, moon waxing, all the stars that heaven bears for garland. And then over the next several stanzas, we get elaborate descriptions of artwork on the shield. 2 cities, noble scenes, weddings in one, and a war going on in the other. We have uh, other references. Upon the shield, soft terrain, freshly plowed, he pictured. A broad field and many plowmen here and there upon it. Some were turning ox teams at the plowland's edge, and there as one arrived in turn, a man came forward, putting a cup of sweet wine in his hands. Going on, a vineyard then he pictured, weighted down with grapes. A little later, the artisan made next a herd of longhorns fashioned in gold and tin. Away they shambled, lowing from byre to pasture, by a stream that sang in ripples, and by reeds asway. So you may be familiar. This is the section of Homer's Iliad where Achilles' shield, his new shield, is described in great detail. If you're familiar with the Iliad, you know Achilles has been sitting out of the action for a while, much to the chagrin and the discontent of the Greek generals Menelaus and so on. And but his dear friend Patroclus has been killed wearing Achilles' armor, and the armor was stripped from Patroclus by the Trojans after his death, and so Achilles has decided to get back into the fray to avenge his friend's death, but he has no armor now, and so his mother, his divine mother Thetis, goes to the divine armorer, blacksmith Hephaestus or Vulcan, depending on which name you want to use, and so he fashions him an elaborate suit of armor and an especially elaborate shield on which there are all these pictures of things taking place in great detail. And I bring it up because it's a section that reminded me the very first time I read Vernon Lee's The Wedding Guest. I'm sorry, The Wedding Chest, rather. Um, and As you know, because several of you commented on it in your posts, it begins with, first of all, a sort of catalog description of this chest. And then it goes into a detailed description of the 4 portions or regions on the chest and how they are um, adorned. The first was a pheasant country, abundantly watered with twisting streams. The second region was somewhat mountainous, but showing large store of lordly castles and thickets. The third region was barren of all vegetation, save huge thorns and ungrateful thistles. And finally, the fourth region was a melancholy cypress wood, among which roosted owls and ravens and other birds, and so on and so on. So we begin with a description of this chest and its artistic rendering, and it gives us a good opportunity, I think, to talk about a couple of related techniques and that is intertextuality, which if you've had other courses with me, you know that's something I'm really interested in. And then also a type of intertextuality, which we call allusions, which I know you're familiar with, where you allude to, you mention some well-known, presumably, whatever poem or piece of artwork or fact from history or whatever it might be, in order to sort of further illuminate whatever you are writing about. And so I want to talk about both of those related techniques, and why we might use them, and some of the potential difficulties in using them, and that kind of thing. Um, as a literature teacher, whenever I'm teaching a text that has an intertext, has another text that the author is using and inserting into their story, I think it's always worth stopping and looking at it and thinking about it carefully, because obviously they had some artistic purpose in inserting whatever it is, whether it's a novel that then they're inserting into their text a poem or a song or a description of a work of art, whether it's an artistic shield or an artistic chest, or maybe the description of a scene in a play, or whatever it might be, Juliet at her balcony or something like that. Whenever they insert that into their text, again, they obviously feel it's important, and so we should give it some serious thought ourselves. As writers, when we're tempted to do that, we obviously want to give some thought to what we want to bring into the text and what we hope readers may take from it, and so on. Um, Intertextuality, it has a lot of different features. By combining texts in that way, it should enhance both texts, and we should start to think about both texts in different kinds of ways because of their being brought together in that way. So if we just skip over an intertextual passage and don't give it much thought, we obviously aren't giving the original text the time to sort of use that intertextual moment, and so on. So again, as writers, we want to think about what kind of texts are we bringing into play. Now, we can use outside material, right? We can bring someone else's poem or someone else's, again, work of art or whatever it might be into the text. Or we can create the intertext ourselves. We can create a poem or a song lyric or whatever we want it to be ourselves, and maybe attribute it to some fictional persona, perhaps, but it still functions in a similar kind of way. Now, it doesn't carry with it the weight of familiarity the way an allusion can, in which, again, we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. But it can still have this play, this sort of synergy, by having the two different texts kind of work together. So again, you can insert your own sort of intertexts. I've been, something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because of various things that I've been reading. As you may know, I'm a Joyce fan, James Joyce fan. I teach a course in Ulysses. Some of you have taken that. Hopefully, some of you will take it when it's offered, I think, again this summer. But really, in terms of Joyce's work, what I've been most focused on in recent years is Finnegans Wake, which you may be familiar with because of its difficulty. It is very, very hard to make sense of. In fact, it's so hard, it's so difficult that generally, people who try to read it in groups. And in fact, I've organized an online reading group for Finnegans Wake. And so every Thursday evening, a bunch of us get together via Zoom and we look at some pages. We normally try to only focus on no more than 5 pages at a time. Even that is plenty to talk about, more than enough to talk about in the hour and a half that we plan to talk. Some Finnegans Wake groups only do a page per meeting, and even a page can fill up the time easily because there are um, so many allusions and so many head scratching sort of references that it just takes that much combined effort to try to make some sense of it. And I do want to get back to that further about the Wake, but part of what Joyce is doing in the Wake is including his own intertextual passages. For instance, one of the early ones we encountered is known as the Ballad of Perce O'Reilly, and it's a song, which Joyce has written the music and the lyrics to, and it goes on, 3 or 4 pages here, and it's an important passage. They're all important, and so one can spend time uh, deciphering this song and what it has to do with the novel as a whole, and other specific sort of ideas and themes that Joyce seems to be playing with in the novel. Like I said, it's also got music. I'm not a musician, so when I look at the notes on the page, sadly, they don't form any kind of score in my head. But you can go online, you can find plenty of people on YouTube and so on who have actually played the music and set the song to music as Joyce intended, presumably, and can listen to the song in that way. But again, inserting it into the text of the novel, but it is an intertext that Joyce has created himself. And again, that is not uncommon. Another example, as you know, I'm a Joyce fan, but my number one interest is the novelist and story writer and essayist and everything else William H. Gass. And in his classic kind of magnum opus, The Tunnel, I can't show you the front cover because I had a dog that removed it because I was spending more time with the novel than I was with her. And I can't blame her. She was right about that at the time. But again, just filled with sort of intertextual um, moments created by Gass himself. For example, one of the characters that he writes about um, is a limerick poet. And as you know, limericks are sort of humorous, um, poems, usually pretty bawdy, pretty dirty. And sure enough, these are. And so just sprinkled throughout the text are these limericks, supposedly written by one of the characters in the novel, but obviously written by Gass and inserted here and there along the way. And so again, the point is that as a writer, we can bring others' work into our writing, um, or we can create the other texts, the alternate texts ourselves. Um, one of the things you run into from just a practical standpoint is if you want to bring into the text material that is still under copyright, then you have to go through the process of getting permission to use, that poet's, stanza or that songwriter's lyrics or whatever it might be. Obviously, if you wanted to bring the intertextual moment into your work via the reproduction of an image, which is another way of doing it, having not just referencing a painting, for example, but actually having a picture of the painting there, that would also require permissions and so forth. Sometimes that's fairly easily had, and and whoever holds the copyright can be quite generous and just give you permission without any cost. Other times, it's not as easy to do, either because it's hard sometimes to track down who owns the copyright, or whoever owns it doesn't want to give it up for free, and they want some money for letting you use it, which is fair. And so then you have to work out, or your publisher has to work out how all that is going to play out. And unfortunately, I think that leads a lot of writers, especially if they don't have a big publisher that they're publishing with, to just sort of leave out those kinds of references, because it's just kind of opening a can of worms, so to speak. But on the other hand, there are lots of poems and songs and things that are not copyrighted. They're either beyond copyright or they were never copyrighted. And so you can pull those into your work without having to worry about, paying for copyright, getting permissions, and those kinds of things. So yeah, so intertextuality is what Vernon Lee is doing there by having this other text, this chest that's elaborately decorated. And then what is it doing for the story? I mean, the story begins with this intertextual moment, which is a little bit different. Normally, you think of stories kind of beginning, in the process of the plot of the conflict or whatever, and then maybe later on, if there's going to be an intertextual or multiple intertextual moments, they're going to come a little bit later in the story. But she begins with that, which is interesting. But like I said, intertextuality is related to allusions. Allusions, of course, are when you refer to something, a novel or a play or a character or whatever it might be, a work of art, a ballet, an opera, a historical moment, a historical figure. Could be a number of things, but you reference them. Now, here's the difference. I believe it is a type of intertext, but if you're just referencing, whatever, and not explaining it, not bringing the text itself, but just mentioning it, you're obviously relying on the reader to fill in the blanks of knowing, what and who you're talking about, and connecting the dots on, oh, that's why they're referencing Juliet, as in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet on her balcony, for example. And so you're relying on the reader to get it, and bring with them whatever emotions or whatever they might associate with that original thing, original character, original title, whatever, and then kind of transplanting it, mapping it onto, or however you want to say, your text, and getting therefore something out of it. Again, allusions can be tricky. It's been said by somebody, I guess I'll say it now, that traditionally there were 4 sort of categories of allusions that writers could reference and feel pretty confident that most of their readers were going to get it. We're going to understand the references, and those 4 sources for allusions were the Bible, history, the Peloponnesian War, the Crimean War, whatever, Battle of Midway, and so on. So the Bible, history, classical mythology, meaning Greek and Roman, primarily mythology, and then Shakespeare. So again, when Hemingway, Faulkner, Woolf, and so on were writing in their heyday in the early part of the 20th century, they could drop references to any of those things without explaining them, and they could rest, pretty confidently that the typical reader would get it, would understand what Greek myth they were alluding to, what Shakespearean character they were alluding to, and how it sort of fit in with what they were talking about. maybe starting around 1960-ish, and then progressively becoming more of a phenomenon throughout the later part of the 20th century and certainly into the 21st century. Writers lost that tool, um, because nowadays, readers probably don't get it, at least very easily. If you drop a character from mythology or from Shakespeare or from ancient history or more recent history or the Bible, a lot of readers are not going to get it. They're not going to understand what you are referencing. So it's sort of a lost cause to do it, maybe. Um, now, I'd be interested to know how you feel about that, if you feel that that's true, or do you feel like you can reference a myth or a Shakespeare play or a historical figure, and and your reader will understand what you're talking about. Um, I do those things. I kind of do it in a couple of different ways. Sometimes I do just put it out there. I just refer to Sisyphus, or I refer to the witches in Macbeth, or whatever it might be, and I just leave it there. And if readers get it, they get it, or if they don't, they don't. Sometimes, though, I give them a little bit of help. I'll make an allusion, but then I'll kind of follow it up in some way to sort of cover my bases. So if they don't get it, then I'm kind of helping them along to understanding the connection between what I just alluded to and so forth. Presumably, if they went to the trouble of looking up the original and understood it more fully, they would then understand my use of it more fully. But at least they have some sense of why that reference is in there. So yeah, so you can just either drop it in there or drop it with a little bit of help. But I do think that it's certainly worth trying. Now, sometimes I'll read stories by younger writers, and they will allude to something very, very contemporary. They'll allude to a current band, a current song, a movie that was popular last year, and the trouble with that is that we live in such a fractured time period that we don't really experience the same sorts of things. When I was a kid, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, graduated from high school in 1980. There still was a lot of commonality in terms of what people experienced. So, we only had 3 TV networks. And so families that watched the evening news, didn't matter whether they were watching CBS or NBC or ABC, they were covering essentially the same stories. School curriculum was pretty standard. There wasn't a lot of talk about breaking the canon and getting out of the canon and including other writers and writers from other demographic backgrounds into the reading list. And so, if you were in high school, you were reading Hemingway and you were reading Shakespeare and you were reading Faulkner and Walt Whitman, and so people graduating even with just a high school degree had a sort of common frame of reference of most literature. And on and on and on. One other example I wanted to mention. So I grew up in a fairly large town, but we still only had like 2 movie theaters. Most of the time I was growing up, and one of them only had 1 screen, and the other one had 2 screens. That was exciting. So generally speaking, again, most of the time I was growing up, at most there would be like 3 different movies playing in town, and if one was popular, I think Star Wars stayed there for months. The Godfather, was in the one theater. It was the only movie you could see for months and months and months, things like that. And so even like if in that town at least, you kind of knew if you'd seen a movie recently, you could probably count on the fact that most people around you had seen that movie recently. Well, again, now it doesn't work that way, obviously, because of the internet, because of streaming services, and so on, and then also, Spotify and other music streaming services and so forth. People are, experiencing, watching, listening to just, an infinite number of things. So if you are into a particular band on Spotify, it's possible that there really aren't that many people in your circle who even have any idea who that band is, let alone, what their songs are. So if you allude to a song by a certain band that maybe it means a lot to you, but what are the odds that someone's going to read your short story or whatever and going to get that reference, right? So I think it's much more difficult now to use allusions effectively compared to writers of previous generations. Again, because readers no longer, very readily at least, recognize references to those four primary sources for allusions: the Bible and history and mythology and so on, Shakespeare, but also just contemporary events. People don't share the same experiences, and obviously we don't want to get too far afield here, but I mean, we're living in a country where there are two different sets of reality. Even, depending on where you get your information from, you think the world is this way, or you think the world is this way. So I mean, it's really, really fractured. Yeah, you have options as a writer, but I think it is tricky now, um, because of the difficulty of using illusions and being confident that people will make sense of them. Does that mean you shouldn't use them? Absolutely not. And I think the best example of why we should not avoid um, the use of illusions, I'll get back to Finnegans Wake. As I mentioned, it is famously difficult to read. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is the number of allusions and the obscurity of the allusions. Now, Joyce did draw from those sort of classic categories I mentioned. There are plenty of references to Hamlet and Shakespeare, Hamlet and Macbeth and Richard III and The Tempest and on and on and on. He himself was a teacher at times and did lectures on Hamlet in particular, and so that shows up a lot in both Ulysses and in Finnegans Wake. So anyway, there are references to Shakespeare. There are references to nursery rhymes. Humpty Dumpty comes up a lot in Finnegans Wake, for example. References to history. The Battle of Waterloo, for instance, is referenced a lot, and so Napoleon and Wellington and so forth are referenced a lot in the book. Yeah, biblical references all over the place, Moses especially, and on and on and on. So he definitely uses familiar sources of material for his illusions, but beyond that, the rest of them are just really, really obscure, and that's why you need people from various backgrounds, various expertises to kind of read the book together, along with all kinds of reference material, resource material that's been written and published over the decades, to try to decode the various references and what they mean and what they may be contributing to the story and so forth. And yet, obviously, this book has its admirers. So, in spite of the obscurity of so many of the allusions, um, people still read it, and they're curious enough about those references to try to look them up and figure out what they mean and so forth. Obviously, I think a new writer, trying to publish today, turning in something as complex and as filled with obscure allusions as Finnegans Wake would be problematic. But that isn't to say that you then have to avoid all obscure references. And again, nowadays, for most readers, every reference is pretty obscure. You can put those in there. And again, there will be some people who will recognize them and understand what you're getting at. There will be people who will care enough to look them up and see what you're talking about. Obviously, with the internet, that's even easier than ever, right? You don't have to go to your library and find a reference book and look up something or whatever. So there will be people who will do that. And the other thing too is, and this is very sort of getting into sort of the psychology or the neuropsychology of it or something, there is a sense that adding those layers of allusions, of symbols, will give more complexity to your writing, even if people aren't necessarily getting the allusions. And maybe a good comparison, or at least a fair comparison, is the portrait painter or the landscape painter or whatever kind of painter who will paint layer upon layer of different colors on the canvas before they sort of put the layer on that the layers on that then depict human figures or a bowl of apples or whatever it is. So you could do a simple line drawing of a bowl of apples and make it recognizable as such. And someone looking at a painting where there's 30 layers of paint beneath the bowl of apples won't necessarily know that for a fact. They couldn't necessarily articulate all the different layers of colors and so on. But yet, somehow or another, those layers come through to us in our viewing, and we get a sense of the complexity and the sensuality or whatever you want to say of the painting without being able to say for sure, well, that's because there's 30 layers of color kind of working together that we can't quite differentiate, but yet they are working on our sense of the painting nevertheless. And that can happen, I think, in literature too, where allusions can add to the complexity of your writing, even if the reader doesn't immediately recognize the reference to this myth or this Shakespearean character or this time in history or whatever it might be. So yeah, definitely recommend, obviously using allusions and intertextuality, even if nowadays it's harder for readers to maybe figure out what you're talking about. Again, those intertexts and those allusions can come from all kinds of different places. One of the books I'm reading right now, I've kind of gotten into Icelandic authors, and this is one of the Icelandic authors I've been reading. I'm not even sure how to say his name. Shion? Probably not. But this is his novel, From the Mouth of the Whale. And there he is. Very popular writer in Iceland. This obviously translated edition. I don't speak Icelandic, unfortunately. But in this novel, which is a kind of retelling of Jonah and the Whale, what the author does is, when referencing all kinds of flora and fauna, he will give a little inserted, almost like a textbook definition here, reference to the blue bottle fly. And so says the blue bottle lays oblong eggs from which maggots hatch. If they are kept in a bull's horn, come the spring, they will turn into flies that the trout enjoys. The blue bottle is fat and as thick as a man's thumb. And these are just dropped throughout the text. Here is reference to the humpback whale. The shellhead or humpback whale has shells and barnacles covering most of its head. Wherever the water is deep enough, it rubs itself against barnacle-encrusted rocks. And it goes on and on from there. Just go back a few pages. And the Jerusalem haddock, another type of fish. And 9 ells long, the fairest of all fish, with a girth almost equal to that of a flounder. And so using these almost like scientific definitions of the various fish, the various flora, and so forth that we are encountering in the story, adds this other layer to it, right? And so, does the novelist expect us to know all these different references? Probably not. So he is helping us out by adding this intertext of scientific definitions, or at least quasi-scientific definitions of these various things. So again, intertext can come from any sort of text, and I think it's important to think of text in more than just a sort of linguistic variety. The term text is related to the term textile and to the term texture, because it originally came from, things like rugs and wall hangings and tapestries, and things like that. And so even the description of other things that are not textual in a linguistic sense can be a sort of intertext. So the description of somebody's outfit, for example, if the writer goes into some detail about what they're wearing, that can be a kind of intertext that we are trying to pick up on and understand why are they wearing that, and why is that description being given to us? What does it have to do with the story and those kinds of things? All right, so I'm gonna stop there. I'm certainly interested in what you have to say about the use of intertexts, about the use of allusions, about whether or not you think those classical sources of allusions are still in force and we can still use them pretty efficiently and effectively, or if they've kind of lost their power somewhat because readers today won't necessarily recognize them very readily. What about creating your own intertextual moments, inserting your own poems or your own quasi-scientific definitions or whatever it is into the text, and really anything about that topic? I would certainly like to hear about it. All right, so there you have it, and I will see you down the road.